Hi, everyone.
Hello. Ray Franz was talking about guilt by association in the last segment, and how the Watchtower manipulates this principle, which is not a New Testament principle, guilt by association, to control the involvement of Jehovah's Witnesses, not just in religion, the idea of one true religion, but also in politics, to keep them away from any kind of commitment that might smack of the world, or the political world specifically. He goes on, the same is true of politics. It's easy to convert this term into a synonym for all the unsavory aspects appearing in human rule. The divisiveness and selfish ambition typical of much political campaigning, with its slurs and smears, along with the hypocrisy, corruption, and tyranny that are all too often to be found in political systems, can be used by this equation to classify as automatically bad anything to which the term political can be attached. It is this same blanket condemnation and categorization that produced the organization's policy in Malawi with its calamitous results, and he refers us to Crisis of Conscience, pages 112 to 116, where he discusses the Malawi situation in detail. But politics basically means government, and the scriptures teach that government definitely has a beneficial aspect.
According to Watchtower policy, if a witness were ordered by the government to serve as a secretary of some government-arranged community administration, as took place in the Philippines with its system of barangays, he must refuse, even at the risk of fine or imprisonment, to avoid disfellowshipment. This is difficult to harmonize with the attitude of Daniel and his three companions during the political rule of the Babylonian and Medo-Persian empires. Not only did Daniel accept appointment to a high position in the Babylonian political structure, he actually requested administrative positions for his three friends. This was not some display of lack of integrity, for they proved themselves willing to face death rather than to be disloyal to God. In the matter of serving in the governmental political structure, they showed conscientious discrimination, not blanket categorization. Christians today can also reject the bad and shun it, while still recognizing whatever good there may be. I could not conscientiously share in political campaigning with its divisive, aggressive tactics, yet that does not cause me to view anything as automatically and intrinsically evil simply because it bears the name political.
With regard to Daniel and his three companions, there is additional evidence of their ability to distinguish what was truly an issue and what was not. This is in connection with the names that were assigned to them by the Babylonians. If not in all, then at least in some cases, those names included the names of Babylonian gods. Nebuchadnezzar himself is shown as specifically saying of the name assigned to Daniel, Belteshazzar, that this was after the name of my God. That's Daniel 4, verses 8 and 9, by the way. Bel, corresponding to the Canaanite Baal, was a chief Babylonian god. I seriously doubt that any of Jehovah's Witnesses would have responded if addressed by a name assigned him by a pagan source and having any connection whatsoever with the name of a false god. Yet, the accounts in the book of Daniel show that when addressed by these names, Daniel and his three companions did not refuse to reply. And here's, I think, where you see the difference between, well, as it says here, ability to distinguish what was truly an issue and what was not. These well-trained young Jewish men did not think it was the politics that contaminated them, or even their being given a foreign name which embedded in it had the name of a Babylonian deity. They didn't think somehow that contaminated them.
No, it was more what they did when confronted with a serious issue, like worshiping a false god. then they were willing to even go to death rather than compromise.
Yeah, I like his phrase, conscientious discrimination, not blanket categorization.
And I think when you look at history, you find the same thing. Christians wrestle with the same kinds of issues that we do at different times. So you have someone like William Wilberforce, who when he became a Christian was already in politics.
Yeah, he was in the British Parliament.
So he had to decide now, and he was trying to make this decision. He was thinking of maybe being a minister, wasn't he?
Yeah, dropping out of Parliament.
Yeah.
Because he was of the aristocracy in England. So he had a seat because of his status. And he thought of leaving it so that he wouldn't be contaminated by politics.
Yeah.
And it was John Newton, as I recall, the author, the former slave owner and slave trader rather,
Who became a minister.
who became a minister, an Anglican minister in London, and the writer of the famous Amazing Grace,
Yeah. So
who persuaded
Yeah.
Wilberforce that no, maybe God has given you this opportunity for a reason. And what became of Wilberforce?
Well, he ended slavery.
Wilberforce became the single greatest name in the abolition movement that came finally to not overthrow the slave trade in the Western world, but end slavery altogether in the British Empire.
Yeah.
So God did use that man to do great good, even though he had personal doubts about conscientious issues at the beginning, at least, as to what should a Christian do.
Yeah.
We've made a video on that, so we probably will link it for you.
And you can link it to biblical stories where people like Daniel, which he spends a lot of time on, Daniel and the three companions, but also someone like Esther would seem a kind of unsavory story otherwise. But her uncle says, who knows but that God put you in this position for this very reason, to save the people.
To save your own people from being massacred.
Yeah.
In the book of Esther, yeah. So the subtlety of mind that this involves, of being able to discriminate between that which is really a compromise and that which is neither good nor bad. It depends on what you do with it. And I think the text that comes to mind most readily for me in this aspect, that when you're a witness, you're not trained to think this way. You are trained to go to your source, and that is always the watchtower. What has the watchtower said?
Yeah, what is their policy?
You go for a rule or a policy rather than ask God to help you with your Bible reading and the evaluation of principles. So the text that comes to mind for me is always Hebrews chapter 5. We should read that from the New World Translation.
Okay. Verses 12 to 14. For indeed, although you ought to be teachers in view of the times, you again need someone to teach you from the beginning the elementary things of the sacred pronouncements of God. And you have become such as need milk, not solid food. For everyone that partakes of milk is unacquainted with the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But solid food belongs to mature people, to those who through use have their perceptive powers trained to distinguish both right and wrong.
So were Daniel and his three companions mature people? Well, they were youths, all right, but they show an astounding maturity of discernment here. Whereas a witness is never encouraged to even seek that.
No, we're kept babies and dependent.
Kept
and fed
dependent.
milk. Always just fed milk.
And the consequence is, in the context, if you read the context of Hebrews 5, right after that, in 6, the possibility is put before the Christians who are called the Hebrews of general or total apostasy. The consequence of being dependent, of always going to the law when you should be going to the gospel. You should be going to principles rather than to legal restrictions or policies.
Having your perceptive powers trained to distinguish both right and wrong.
And if you can't do that, if you're in Judaism in the first century, you're at the mercy of priests. You're at the mercy of what we would call clergy. And And of course, many clergy, as well as priests, and I would say the cults, major in this, making you dependent, causing you to have no choice but to be dependent upon their policies. And of course, that not just results in your being immature and unable to discern right and wrong, but finally has the consequence of you being destroyed.
Having very weak conscience, you don't develop it.
Yeah. In the next segment, Ray goes on with the Watchtower's vision of what neutrality means and makes more comparisons with their approach to the doctrine of pagan origins. I don't suppose we can correctly call it a doctrine. It's their approach to a lot of issues that have to do, in Christian circles at least, with conscience, but in the Watchtower have to do with, well, disfellowshipping offenses.
Yeah.
They become. And this idea that somehow something is contaminated by its pagan origin, of course, affects more than Jehovah's Witnesses. And for that reason, we should understand the biblical point of view more clearly on just what it is about paganism that infects and potentially contaminates and makes you unclean. I don't think any of us really do a very good job of analyzing what spiritual principles are at stake. Because pagan basically means not urban. That's all it really means. Something not very sophisticated, or maybe the significant synonym would be barbarian. But pagan has come to mean, for some reason, in Christian circles as well as the cults, satanic.
Evil. Yeah.
Evil in its essence. For that reason, we should give it more thought, which Ray does in the next segment.